March 3, 1943, dawn broke over Port Moresby, New Guinea. Major Edward Larner's hands were steady on the control column of his B-25 Mitchell bomber as he monitored the fuel gauges and listened to the rhythmic thunder of the twin Wright Cyclone engines. Through the scratched plexiglass of his cockpit window, Larner could see 11 more B-25 seconds forming up behind him, their propellers cutting silver circles through the tropical morning air. The Japanese convoy steaming toward them in the Bismarck Sea had no idea that in the next 15 minutes everything they believed about naval warfare would be shattered. A bombing technique so dangerous, so unorthodox that conventional military wisdom had labeled it nearly suicidal, was about to rewrite the rules of naval engagement. At 200 feet above the ocean surface, Larner and his squadron would attack at speeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour. Close enough to taste the salt spray, close enough to see the expressions on enemy faces before their bombs skipped across the water like stones thrown by giants. The Japanese convoy, coming from Rabaul, had sailed under the protection of 8 destroyers and dozens of Zero fighters, believing they were safe. They were about to discover that the rules of warfare had changed forever. In the months preceding this fateful mission, American bombers had been spectacularly ineffective against Japanese ships. Throughout 1942, American bombers flew at high altitudes between 5,000 and 10,000 feet, releasing bombs that often missed their maneuvering targets by miles. Despite their immense firepower, these bombers failed to deliver decisive strikes, and Japanese convoys continued to resupply their garrisons in New Guinea, securing their hold on the region. The statistics were staggering. In one convoy interdiction attempt in January of 1943, American aircraft flew 416 sorties, managing to sink only 2 ships and damaging 3 others. The Japanese remained confident, continuing to send reinforcements with near impunity, and the tide of the Pacific War seemed to be hanging in the balance. Lieutenant General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force, was a fighter pilot from World War I who had earned a reputation for unconventional thinking. He understood that high-altitude bombing was ineffective because ships could maneuver out of the bomb's path. The time it took for a bomb to fall from 10,000 feet allowed enemy ships nearly a minute to alter course, leaving them small targets. The solution was simple but perilous: bomb from much lower altitudes, so the ships had no time to react. However, flying within a few hundred feet of heavily armed warships violated every principle of bomber survival. Anti-aircraft guns would have a clear shot, and a single hit could bring down the bomber. The risk seemed immense, yet Kenney was prepared to take it. Kenney had heard of a technique that might just change everything. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bombardment Squadron had successfully employed skip bombing at Rabaul on October 22nd to 23rd, 1942. By flying at extremely low altitudes and releasing bombs with delayed fuses, Benn's bombs would skip across the water like flat stones on a pond, hitting the hulls of ships with devastating force. While Benn's technique worked, he was killed before perfecting it for large-scale daylight operations. No one had yet attempted coordinated attacks with entire squadrons using this method. No one had modified aircraft for such low-altitude missions, and no one had trained units to execute the split-second timing necessary to skip bombs accurately under fire. The responsibility for perfecting the technique fell to Major Paul Gunn, a former naval aviator whose personal rage against the Japanese fueled his passion for the task. Gunn's modifications to the B-25 Mitchell transformed it into what came to be known as the Commerce Destroyer. Gunn's team worked tirelessly, stripping the bombardier position from the nose of the B-25 and replacing it with 4 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. They added more weapons along the fuselage, eventually mounting 8 to 12 heavy machine guns that all fired forward, making the B-25 a flying battleship capable of laying down heavy suppressive fire. These machine guns would serve several purposes. They would suppress enemy anti-aircraft fire by sweeping the enemy decks clear of gunners, and the powerful 50 caliber rounds could pierce destroyer hulls, knock out gun positions, and create chaos aboard target vessels. The guns also allowed pilots to aim the aircraft itself like a weapon, simplifying targeting by giving pilots a simple reference mark on their windscreen. Training began in January of 1943, with B-25 crews practicing their low-level bombing runs on the SS Pruth, a wrecked British steamer. For weeks, crews honed their skills, diving to 200 feet and releasing practice bombs at the rusting hulk of the steamer. Each pilot dropped 30 to 40 bombs, learning to use a reference mark on their windscreen instead of a bomb site. The training was grueling. When one crew crashed during training, killing all aboard, the squadron mourned their loss, but resumed training the very next day. Lana's relentless drive and fearlessness fueled the squadron's preparation. He knew that the success of this tactic could prevent the Japanese from reinforcing their positions in New Guinea and potentially change the course of the war. The moment of truth came on March 1st, 1943, when American reconnaissance flights identified a Japanese convoy steaming toward New Guinea. This convoy, made up of 8 transport ships carrying 6,900 troops, was heavily guarded by 8 destroyers. Despite this formidable protection, the Allies were prepared. The plan called for B-17 Flying Fortress bombers to strike first, scattering the convoy and forcing the ships into evasive maneuvers. Then, Lana's modified B-25 seconds would strike, followed by Australian bow fighters at wave-top height. The aim was to overwhelm the convoy's defenses with a coordinated, multi-layered attack. Timing and precision would be critical. On March 3rd, the attack began at 10 a.m. With the convoy in sight, Lana and his squadron approached from the southeast at 200 feet, preparing to skip their bombs directly into the hulls of Japanese ships. The B-25 seconds fired their forward guns, clearing the decks of enemy sailors before releasing their bombs. The bombs skipped across the water and struck the hulls of the destroyers and transports, devastating the convoy. The impact of the attack was immediate. The Japanese gunners, trained to fire at high-altitude bombers, were caught off guard by the B-25 seconds, flying at such a low altitude. Bombs skipped across the water and detonated against the ship's hulls with devastating effect, sinking or heavily damaging most of the convoy. In just 15 minutes, the B-25 seconds had crippled the convoy, leaving the Japanese vessels sinking or ablaze. Japanese destroyers attempted to return fire, but the B-25 seconds suppressive fire from the forward guns made it nearly impossible to man exposed gun positions. The speed and violence of the attack left the Japanese gunners unable to react. By 10:15 a.m., most of the convoy was sinking, and the water around the Bismarck Sea was filled with debris, oil slicks, and Japanese sailors abandoning ship. By the end of the battle, all 8 transport ships had been destroyed, and 3 of the 8 destroyers were either sunk or heavily damaged. In total, more than 2,800 Japanese soldiers and sailors were killed, either going down with their ships or drowning in the oil-slicked waters. Only 4 destroyers managed to escape, but even these vessels were damaged. The Allied losses were light. 13 airmen were killed, and 8 others were wounded, but the impact of the victory was immeasurable. The tactics developed in the Battle of the Bismarck Sea revolutionized naval warfare, proving that land-based aircraft could dominate naval convoys without the support of surface ships or carriers. However, the aftermath of the battle left a moral controversy. Allied pilots were ordered to strafe lifeboats and machine gun survivors in the water to prevent them from reaching shore. The justification was military necessity. Every Japanese soldier who reached land would have to be fought by American or Australian troops in the brutal jungles of New Guinea. Still, the orders haunted those who carried them out, leaving many to struggle with the ethics of the decision. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in the Pacific War. The techniques perfected by Major Edward Larner and his squadron proved that low-altitude bombing could be a devastatingly effective strategy. These methods would be used to sink hundreds of Japanese ships over the next 2 years, cutting off supply routes and contributing significantly to Japan's eventual defeat. Edward Larner did not live to see the end of the war. Tragically, he was killed in a flying accident on April 30th, 1943. But his legacy lived on through the tactics he developed, the men he led, and the victory that shifted the balance of the war. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea proved that innovation, courage, and determination could overcome even the most entrenched military doctrines. Major Larner's sacrifice and vision left an indelible mark on the history of warfare, one that is still remembered and studied to this day.